right, welcome everybody to this episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. I am your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Frohman. We've got some great sponsors we'll show you here momentarily. We've, of course, got, as usual, your Freedom Hub, but then more recently, the mphealthwealthfreedom.com, which is actually like a publication you'll see. And we are uniting all the activists and entrepreneurs, where we're really trying to disrupt kind of the status quo to make things a little bit better for all of us. And this is where we get a chance to get some synergies going between ourselves and some of our various guests. We are recording all of these. They're typically released on the weekends. If you're not already getting this, you can register at this upper link. We send a unique one each week, unique to the guest, but you have a generic one here. And we are posting to all these various channels. The links are case sensitive, just be aware. And just to give you a little sidebar, we also have one of our key sponsors, and actually let me step up to the front here. This is Heaven Sent Hemp. They're offering a special discount, but why we're mentioning this is in our research and people that we try to synergize with, this is found to be the most effective product that we've ever discovered because it's bioactive. Basically, all the rest of the stuff are relatively inert. It's a rather interesting differentiator here. And just to show you kind of through what we've got available for you, we've got our Working Hood group on LinkedIn, so you might want to become a member of this. Here's an example of some of the videos that we've posted over time, and there's some really excellent ones. Even the ones that just keep going back in time, they're still extremely cogent. Just like today's guest, this is a timeless bit of information. It's not topical where it's going to become dated. Here's Freedom Hub itself. And then again, as I said, we've got this affiliate here that we found with these special hemp products. And here you'll see, because here they're putting their money where their mouth is, because you can immediately prove if any that you're aware of works compared to theirs and how they do tests. So you can prove specifically why and how you can determine that it actually functions. And then lastly, as I mentioned, this is a new publication. This is a good example about where we're at today to give you why this is such an important site to bookmark and come back to on a regular basis. But this is what's happening. So here's today's list, and here's today. Interesting is going to be John, and Charles is going to do a great introduction here momentarily. We have a great thing tonight about the false explosion in cases caused by the CDC tonight. So that's another great little topic that we definitely all need to know about. A list of the guests that are coming in the coming weeks, and then also the links to those various channels I mentioned, so you'll be able to see stuff. And then ideally, you maybe missed it obviously for today, but we're promoting this event with Cato Institute on the idea of licensing for doctors and stuff. So this will be a great little place for you to connect. So on that great note though, let's shift gears and jump into today, because this is going to be really exceptionally good talk today. Charles, can you do the honors, please?
I certainly can, Jeff, and welcome, John. We're excited to broach this topic because you know, I'm an old history teacher, and one thing I like to say is history is a combination of two words, his and story. And I always discourage my students from seeing anything in history as an either or. Instead, look at the nuance and think of the bias inherent in the storyteller. And World War II is no exception. You know, Tom Brokaw, the old anchor, tried to characterize World War II as the good war. But how can any war be good? And to broach this controversial thesis, we have an economist, John Chapman, from Hill and Cutler, and he'll tell us a bit about that company. He was a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and is a frequent columnist, often on the warfare state. He's also written on applying Austrian economics to business at the Mises Institute. And so that is our introduction, Jeff.
Very good. All right. I'm going to give him control of the screen here. So I'm turning off my screen. And now, if you would please recapture.
All
so
right.
Go ahead. Take it away. Thanks, John.
Well, great. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Charlie. It's a real pleasure to be with you both here today. And I met Charlie several years ago via some online facility, and I can't even remember how or where, some sort of social media deal. So I'm aware of your Freedom and what your efforts have been about here at Freedom Hub. So it's a real honor to be here. The quick 20-second background on me is I'm passionate about economics. and went on to study that at the graduate level. But then I've also been a lifetime student of military and naval history and the geopolitical ramifications of how foreign policy, national defense work. And today's it's a great time to talk about World War II today, because as you history buffs know, tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the first atomic bomb. So it's a good moment to dive into this. So I've got 9 or 10 slides here. Probably a 25 or 30-minute discussion is a pretty simple thesis I'll offer, and certainly then have time for any Q&A or follow-up. The other thing I would say is, as similar to Charlie, I'm a former teacher from many moons ago, and I always try and make any sort of talk that I do a learning vehicle. So I freely offer anybody that wants to follow up in terms of what would be appropriate articles, books to read, how can I learn more. Even if you don't agree with me, that's fine. I certainly have all kinds of sources, pro and con. So very quickly, the World War II, when it's talked about, and Charlie mentioned, I think, Tom Brokaw's book, which certainly canonized and lionized World War II to a more modern audience. But really, going back 75 years, World War II has always been sort of this canonical, mythical, patriotic, giant effort in U.S. history, and it's seen as good. It has been called the Good War, and I'll get to that in a minute in terms of where that term came from. But you can get into any academic conference, you can talk to people on the street, your local cocktail party. Whenever people talk about warfare in American history, they may disagree about Korea, Vietnam, the more recent wars in the Middle East, but you'll be hard pressed to find anybody that says World War II was not necessary, critical, and a great and brilliant victory for the United States. And I myself went through most of my life probably more or less accepting that passively. But as the years have gone on and the deeper I got into the study of American history, of military and naval history, of our wars, and I go all the way back to the American Revolution, I've probably read 150 books or somewhere. I need to count them up sometime, but I've done a ton of reading. I don't claim to be an expert, but I've pondered this topic for a long time. And I'm now very certain that World War II, as I'll get into here in a minute, probably should have never been fought at all, and certainly was not something the United States should have been involved in. And B, at the close of the talk, I offer a couple of lessons why it's still a relevant topic, not only from a historical perspective, a la an anniversary such as tomorrow with Hiroshima, but why there are real lessons in what happened for today and how we prosecute our foreign policy going forward. I should also mention it's important just from the calamity that has befallen us this year with what I'm calling the COVID-19 depression. The fiscal burdens of this most recent spending output on the part of the U.S. government has been astronomical. When Trump took office, the U.S. national debt was a little north of $20 trillion. The aggregated present value of all future obligations of the United States, as computed by Professor Lawrence Kolikoff, who's a great economist at Boston University, is approximately $200 trillion. In other words, Kolikoff goes all the way out, decades into the future, adds up all the obligations, then adds up what the likely sources for government revenue are, and he's got a $200 trillion gap. And now that number has certainly increased, because now we've just spent several $1 trillion more this year fighting this virus. Well, the reason that matters is that if you divide up all that spending, a lot of it has been on warfare. The Watson Institute at Brown University is a think tank there in Providence dedicated to the study of war and American warfare and the costs of war. And they calculate that just since 1990 in the Middle East, in present value terms, and that includes all the cash streams we need to pay for our wounded warriors going into the future, the running tab on the wars in the Muslim world are now $7 trillion and counting. So 7 trillion divided by 26 trillion is a big percentage just on the wars in terms of the current debt. So it's a huge fiscal problem when we get into wars that we probably shouldn't. So there's a big economic reason to study this topic, and of course there are moral and strategic reasons as well. Okay, so very quickly, as I go through this discussion, and again, it'll be pretty quick, and I think the facts and the discussion are pretty straightforward. The one thing I always ask audiences to keep in mind when I do talk about this is to keep in mind that the United States, set up by our founding fathers, is a republic. We are not an empire. We are not a global policeman, at least the way our founders looked at things. And so as George Washington, on September 19, 1796, published his farewell address, and he warned of becoming an empire. And he goes through this long discussion of things that could go wrong in America's future. And he said, he warned his countrymen, please in the future avoid entangling alliances, as he called them. Do not get involved in Europe's intrigues or the wars of other countries with whom we should be at peace. And his phrase roughly that I've adapted is that the foreign policy of a commercial republic dedicated to freedom is friend of liberty everywhere, guarantor only of our own. John Quincy Adams, who was our 6th president, was a member of the House of Representatives in 1821. On July 4th of that year, on our nation's birthday, he gave a very famous speech. And I've got his key quote there for you. And he basically said, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She's the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but she is the champion and vindicator only of her own. And then he went on to say in a brief discussion that by pursuing this foreign policy, friend of liberty to all, magnanimity for all, but guarantor only of our own, in other words, truly national defense, not offense, but defense, John Quincy Adams pointed out, and again, he confirmed, by the way, what George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe had talked about before him, which is that America would thereby accrue a moral authority in modern terms in being able to go out to the world and saying, we want peace, commerce, and friendship, in Jefferson's famous terms, with everybody. So it's really important to sort of level set your own thinking about that we really, we have, and I call us a quasi-empire. We certainly act like one. We have become the de facto global policeman. There's a very definite reason why and how that happened. I'll get to in a minute. But the point is at the undergirding of your thinking and analysis. And when I debate this topic with people who do believe, such as Bill Kristol, who says, no, America needs, we have this great national assignment given to us by the Almighty, that we need to be the global policeman. We need to be the guarantor of open sea lanes around the world. We need to be able to project power. We need to be able to fight 2 wars on 2 different fronts anywhere around the world. And by the way, my old colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute are all of this mind. I tell people as a quick aside, if you know the think tanks in Washington, D.C., even though I'm an AEI alumnus and I love AEI, certainly the economic policy team there, but in terms of foreign policy, I'd be more of a Cato or Mercatus guy. So I used to have with John Bolton, Michael Ledeen, Paul Wolfowitz, a lot of people who've been through AEI are of this America needs to be this great power and this global policeman. And I always used to say to them, look, that is absolutely not what our founding fathers had in mind. And there are good things that accrue to us if we can get back to where we're supposed to be. In terms of this interesting euphemism, what World War II being known as the Good War, I spent some time trying to find out where that came from. And if you do a Google search on it and a lit search, you come up with hundreds of uses for it. But I think it was a political scientist at Yale University by the name of Bruce Russett, who's the first guy that I saw use that in a published paper. And he basically made the point that from pretty much the onset of peace, right after World War II, which quickly became a historical fact of huge import and was, of course, thousands of books and articles and everything that has followed. And we still today, 75 years later, when we talk about the time after World War II, we call it the post-war era. And that's kind of a cultural term as well as historical. That it was Professor Russet who used the term and said, we can debate all these other wars before or since, but World War II is known as this good war. Why? Well, there were these evil dictators in Germany and Japan, and to a lesser degree Italy. It's frequently, you can turn on the History Channel, or you can turn on what used to be the Military History Channel. Now I think it's called the American Heroes Channel. You can look at movies on cable TV, documentaries. They always talk about World War II in terms of we had these evil empires, these evil dictators that we had to defeat. Nobody else in the world could do it. And then you hear, and these are what I call the beginning of a serial lying that goes on about World War II, where motives are ascribed to Germany and Japan that flat out are untrue. And so you'll frequently hear and these PhD historians like to say, well, Germany and Adolf Hitler in combination with Japan wanted to, quote unquote, take over the world. And they were going to attack the United States. There's a serial documentary on the American Heroes Channel that talks about Hitler's plans for invasion of America. And with a long discussion I could have about things like that, most of that is nonsense. When you go back and read the original documents, including Mein Kampf, by the way, which I encourage all historians and students of World War II to do, to really understand what was going on the other side, and all of Hitler's writings and speeches, Hitler wanted to avoid war with America. He wanted nothing to do with war, or with England for that matter. His eyes were always toward the east. But anyway, the point is, it's always been seen as something that was necessary and was unavoidable. And that's the thesis that I want to challenge here today. A really good analysis, when you go through it, to understand World War II, is to go all the way back to the beginning and go through the history of each and every war that the United States has been engaged in. As a quick aside, the United States is now, about 240 years old. U.S. troops have been in the field, active in combat, in something like 222 of those 240 years. So, for example, U.S. Marines were in Guatemala in 1954. U.S. Marines landed in the Dominican Republic in 1965, that sort of thing. So they're the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 in China. So we could go on and list 1,000 minor conflicts, but there have been, I've listed here, all the major wars, the major conflicts in which the United States was involved. And I could talk for 3 hours on this chart alone, so I'll keep it to 2 minutes. But the net of it is, and I'd be happy to talk further offline with anybody that's ever interested, because I've done quite a bit of reading on each and every one of these conflicts. In each and every case, there is always a historical pretext or discussion. You pick up any history book in 11th grade public high school in the United States, the classic textbook in American history, and you read about these wars, there's always sort of a standard story giving the pretext for the war, why the war was necessary, why the war was fought. And sadly, it's often counterfactual, it's often wrong, and the student is never even encouraged to think, well, okay, is this really true? Is this really accurate? What's being presented here? Could there have been other ways of solving whatever these issues were? So just to take one or two quick examples, we'll go all the way back to 1812. It is true that the United States and Britain, after the Revolutionary War, they'd signed the peace treaty in Paris. They had begun trading. Britain had begun to invest in the United States. They'd been pretty friendly relations. There had been significant transatlantic trade that was developing, but there were issues. And specifically, Britain was continuing to engage in warfare on the continent of Europe, and particularly with France in that era. And so there were people leaking into the United States from both Canada and from Europe that were British subjects that the British wanted back. So as early as 1807, they were complaining about British nationals being on American flag vessels and sort of running away from Britain and running away from their duty to God and King and Queen. So the impressment of sailors, where British warships would stop American flag vessels in the Atlantic and all the way up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States, board these vessels under armed threat, and then take back any British sailors, that was an issue that was happening. But it was very minor. The real reason for the War of 1812 was American politicians in Washington, D.C. said, hey, Britain is going bankrupt. They're fighting all these stupid wars against Napoleon and on the continent. They're distracted. They've got an empire burgeoning in Asia. We've got an opportunity to go after them and take Canada and all its resources. So there's quite a different story on all these wars from what is the standard one presented in textbooks. The Civil War, again, is a huge topic we could talk about separately, but it's important to understand today, and especially with the current contretemps in American politics with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement and the stresses of race relations in the United States. People go back to the United States, and I sometimes hear Republicans say, well, Abraham Lincoln, the founder of the Republican Party, fought a war to free the slaves. It shows how much we Republicans care about black people. We were able to fight this war. Somewhere between 600 and 750,000 Americans died during this war. It cost in current today's dollars several $100 billion. It wrecked half the country for 50 years and so forth. So it was a huge price to pay. But that the reason we fought it was to free the slaves. That's completely ahistorical. The fact is, Lincoln was deeply racist. And I was in a recent debate where I talked about Lincoln versus Robert E. Lee. There's a pretty good argument. Robert E. Lee in 1858 said slavery was a moral and political evil, and it bothered him greatly. He is a slave owner, and he knew it must end, and the only question was how and when. And so again, long story on that, but there was an extensive set of tariffs in place that benefited northern manufacturers, as well as provided revenue to the federal government, which was dominated by the more numerous northern states. There were clear economic, selfish reasons why that war was fought. Lincoln was inaugurated on March the 4th of 1861. He wrote a letter to Alexander Stephens of Georgia, became the vice president of the Confederacy on March 2. And in his, on that day, the Corwin Amendment passed in the U.S. Congress. The Corwin Amendment from Congressman Corwin, sponsored from the state of Ohio, would have cemented slavery in place in the old Confederacy forever. And Lincoln, in his March 4th inaugural address, the first inaugural address, Lincoln is famous for the second one in 1865, but it's the first one that really needs to be paid more attention to. Lincoln said in that speech, I hope there isn't a war. I don't want a war. I'm going to hope to avoid one. I have no quarrel. I can't constitutionally change things. And I'm all for the Corwin Amendment. If the South will agree to it, we can all be happy and move on. So Lincoln was more than happy to give slavery to the South in perpetuity, as long as they didn't leave the Union and wreck what was an advantageous economic relationships. It's important to understand that not only for the current context of today's history, but again, it just the underlying economic motivations that drive so many of these wars. So let's fast forward to World War I. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election and bragged openly, said, hey, I've kept us out of war. There will be no American boys going to war. And this was a year and a half after the Lusitania had been sunk. There were obviously some heartburn over that, but the United States went to Germany and said, hey, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. So for the first few years of that conflict, the United States stayed out of it. But eventually, then of course came the Zimmermann telegram from the Germans. The British were agitating to get the Americans into that war on their side, just as they were to do some 23 years later. Winston Churchill was involved both in World War I and World War II in dragging the United States into the war. But essentially, it was a conflict that the United States could have stayed out of. And then one more on that, World War II, which again I'll get into in a minute. As late as April of 1941, the Gallup polling organization did a nationwide poll, not as sophisticated as they do it today, but still pretty good data. The overwhelming majority of the American people did not want to be involved in any war in either Europe or Asia. And this was congruent with what Franklin Roosevelt himself had also run for re-election on in 1940. I've kept us out of war. No American boy is going to go to war. We're merely going to be the arsenal of democracy. We'll help friendly nations, but there's no reason for us to ever be involved. When all the time Roosevelt was scheming 18 months before the U.S. entered the conflict to get into World War II. So the net of it is all these wars have stories underlying what you learn about in textbooks that really make no sense from either a strategic or a moral perspective. So the answer to the question in terms of which of those 9 conflicts should the United States were both necessary and unavoidable, and the answer is none of them. The true answer is the United States, really since the American Revolution, need not have fought any of these kinetic wars, and all it could have been settled diplomatically and via other arrangements that would have avoided all the war and the bloodshed and what are the countless trillions of dollars in today's terms that have been spent. So the question, and this is really key to understanding how we did get into World War II. Why do we perennially get involved in these various wars around the world? And really in the last 30 years, nonstop perpetual warfare. And the answer is what Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address on January the 17th, 1961. Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex and warned that during his 8 years in office, during his tenure as president, he had noticed how powerful this military-industrial complex was. Now, quick note on that, in his original draft of that speech, he called it the military-industrial congressional complex, which I use the acronym all the time in my readings. I call it MICC. I'm trying to canonize that and get that into the lexicon of American public discussion. The MICC. It's this confluence of all the players inside the Beltway from all the various constituencies that have, for lack of a better term, naked, raw, even ambitious reasons to have the United States engaged in warfare. In that speech, or for that preparatory to that speech, for his farewell address, Eisenhower's advisors begged him to drop the congressional, because in that moniker they said, well, Mr. President, if you use congressional in that term, the problem is that goes after and criticizes our fellow Republicans on Capitol Hill. So Eisenhower took it out of the speech itself, but it's in the record, and it is rightly, and because we all know that there are these forces that centripetally drive the United States into conflict that are resident in the halls of Congress, we need to include the congressional part of that. Ray McGovern, who is a longtime CIA employee, and both as an analyst and I think he was an agent in the field over many decades, still going strong about age 75, by the way, and still active in Washington, D.C. today in discussions about our foreign policy. He calls this the Mickey Mat, and that's actually a better, more exact, more precise term. Military, industrial, congressional, intel community, then media, academia, and think tanks, all the K Street think tanks that are loaded up with analysts that have fancy PhDs and want to take the United States into perpetual conflict. So the short answer is that the reason the United States, and even before Eisenhower coined that term, even before World War II, we go back to World War I, go back to 1898 in Cuba and the Philippines in 1899, where 6,000 Americans died in combat for absolutely no reason at all. in a stupid squabble with the Spanish Empire, which was sort of dying at the time. The reasons are generally economic. There's this umbilical cord between Washington, D.C. and New York City, the halls of finance and the halls of government. And what Angelo Codavia calls the ruling class has reasons to take America into war that benefit this Washington, New York corridor of power. And then I've got the famous graph there from Pete Peterson's group. The United States is today spending more than at least the next 10 countries. And by the time you do a fair accounting of that, by the way, the real, if the United States is spending, well, today we're spending, what, 6 or 7 trillion, but in a normal year, without COVID-19's overlay this year, our budget would have been about 4.8 trillion. We would have spent about 1.2 trillion on a fair accounting of what goes to our military, because in addition to the raw figure of Pentagon spending, which is shown in that graph, there's of course the Veterans Administration, and there's foreign aid, which is really disguised military aid and pre-positioning of military equipment. And there's the several hundred US military and naval bases around the world, both the ones we know about, by the way, and the ones we don't know about. And then there are spending streams in all various departments. The Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation, all have line items totaling tens of billions of dollars that are really related to Pentagon spending. So the real figure is about 1.2 to 1.3 trillion. Far outspending the next several countries combined. The precursor to World War II is, of course, World War I. At the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes took a look at what was developing at the crippling victor's peace that was going to be imposed on Germany. And Keynes famously wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It came out in early 1920, and bluntly said, in 20 years, there's going to be another major European war. It's one of those, I like to tell people, it's one of the few things Keynes unambiguously was correct about. And that's a little bit of a shot. Keynes was actually a really bright guy, and there's a lot to like about his analysis other than his macro policies, but historically, he called that. So the quick thing to say is that with respect to World War I, it was a shame it ever happened. It was dragged into being by a confluence of events. And by the way, that's a topic, if you go to any academic department and get a bunch of historians together and say, let's have a seminar and talk about what caused the First World War, today here, more than a century later, that is still a hot topic of debate. The net of it was there were these shifting alliances, the so-called Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. All of them were empires, had been formed in the late 19th century. In 1914, when the war actually started, Italy turned around and said, hey, we're out, guys. We're not going to fight this war because Austria-Hungary is the aggressor. So they quickly dropped out, and the so-called Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary became the combatants against the Triple Entente, which became the Allied powers, which the United States joined only tangentially, by the way. The United States never formally joined that alliance between Britain, France, and Russia. But there were these shifting power plays and power politics in terms of the balance of power that were going on there late in the 19th century that sort of ruined the progress that had begun at Vienna earlier in that century, the famous Congress of Vienna, with Count Metternich in Austria, Talleyrand in France. All the major European statesmen had gotten together. And again, I just like to offer vehicles for learning. I encourage people, sometimes when you mention Wikipedia, you get laughed out of the pulpit. I think Wikipedia can be, in some cases, fantastic. And the article on that Congress of Vienna, whoever wrote it, is very well done, gives you a tremendous snapshot of what really led to the 20th century by showing how the 19th played out. But it was what Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist, called the Age of Liberalism. It settled many old, burgeoning and simmering complaints and arguments between nations and reasons for strife that had been going on for decades, if not centuries, and led to unparalleled economic expansion really across all of Europe, including in Russia, by the way. And it's a shame Russia wasn't more liberalized by 1914 than they were. But in any event, with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, that began to fracture a little bit. Then these alliances were formed. There were various issues in the colonial sphere. And so there was this general march to some disagreements. And so the key point is to always keep in mind, should the United States have been involved in any of that? And the answer is absolutely, positively not. I hope some of you know who Jim Powell is, great historian at Cato Institute. He wrote a fascinating book in about 2005 called Wilson's War, the folly of Woodrow Wilson getting the United States involved in World War I, which led to absolute century of bloodshed, the worst in human history. And I've outlined in bullet point form here what his fascinating thesis is, one that I completely agree with, and I've added in my own bullet points in the end in terms of the economic angle. But the net of it is, and I'll run through this very quickly, Powell asked the interesting counterfactual question, what if the United States had unambiguously committed to neutrality? In other words, what if the United States had followed the foreign policy enunciated by George Washington and John Quincy Adams and the other founders? Well, several things there in bullet point fashion. Number one, the United States would not have bribed the Kerensky government in Russia in the spring of 1917 to stay in the war. In terms back then, Wilson literally handed over $385 million of U.S. taxpayer funds to Kerensky and said, please stay in the war. In today's terms, that's, depending on the calculation you use, several billions of dollars. And there was also material aid that was given. So it was a big shot in the arm. The Russians could not have stayed in the war without that aid. Germany, knowing that and seeing that and sensing that the United States was not going to enter into World War I, would not have gone through the intrigue of the Zimmerman program and trying to drag Mexico into war, etc., and would have probably likewise figured that there was no need to incite a revolution in Russia. If they knew that they could eventually wear down the weaker foe in the East and then redeploy their forces in the West, they would not have injected the virus of Leninism into the Russian polity, which the Germans knew would be a long-term problem for them. So Lenin, who at the time was living in exile in Switzerland, made his way through the German lines up to Finland, and then, of course, his triumphant return to Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and then became, of course, known as Leningrad. That would never have happened. Kerensky would have cut a deal for peace a year earlier. The Germans would, having won the war in the East, would have repositioned their forces in the West. That would have considerably strengthened their position on the front, running across eastern France and into Belgium, the Low Countries. And that would in turn have made the military position of Britain and France much more precarious. In other words, Britain and France would have been much more mindful and in a mood to negotiate a peace. And by the way, Germany was also fairly exhausted, even in 1917. So there would have been maybe a redrawing of the French-German border by another 30 miles westward. Alsace-Lorraine would have remained in German hands and so forth. Maybe a few colonial land grabs, and the war would have been over. I quickly hasten to add, though, even if the German army had marched into Paris and the flag of the German Empire had been placed atop the Eiffel Tower, the question is, what difference would that have made to the United States? And the honest answer is it wouldn't have. So anyway, the net of it is, no Lenin means no Stalin. No Stalin, of course, means no Bolshevik revolution that succeeds and goes through the terror of the 20s and 30s. Without the United States imposing the victory in the West, which led to Versailles, there would have been no harsh terms of peace at that Versailles Treaty. There would have been no breakdown of the German economy and German civil society, no horrible hyperinflation, which ruined the lives of millions of Germans, led to appalling suffering, which itself and alone was the one primordial motivation for a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler. So Germany would not have broken down, and frankly, if Germany had maintained its economy and stable society, there would have been no Hitler. Furthermore, there would have been no gyration in the U.S. economy. The U.S. went off the goal. There was this big inflation in the late 19 teens. It led to this, what was then called a depression in 1920 and 21. Then the U.S. deflated the dollar in sympathy with the pound when Churchill became the Chancellor of the Exchequer and incorrectly revalued the pound at the pre-war rate, which led to a horrible deflation, downturn, and depression in first England and then on the continent. So the net of it is the gyrations in the macroeconomy would have been less severe, and so the Great Depression may not have happened at all, but even if there had been some sort of downturn, it would have been a lot less severe, and that in turn would have also meant for a less radical Germany. So the net of it is, and the punchline to this great book, which I urge everybody to read, even if you don't agree with it at the end of it, but I think you will if you're honest with yourself and you do your homework, is there may not have been a World War II at all. If there had been a World War II, it would have been a lot smaller in scope. And oh, by the way, coming out of World War I, I argue, and in other readings, the United States began to grow, for lack of a better term, arrogant. So there was this little meeting in Washington, D.C. in 1922 between the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, which led to the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which circumscribed the ability of the Japanese to grow their naval power. And at the time, they felt they suffered the consequences. They felt they didn't have a choice. They were never allowed to build ships as big or as strong or as fast or as numerous as the U.S. and British fleets. It is something that caused a deep resentment in Japanese military and political circles, and had a direct bearing that is very, very little understood and never talked about in Western analysts, but was a precursor to a more militaristic Japan, which had been Western leaning up until that point. That would have never happened had the United States stayed out of that war. So anyway, the next point to make is, however, even given the fact that World War I occurred and that we followed Woodrow Wilson into that war and all that happened after that, the hyperinflation, the breakdown in Europe, the Great Depression, still, let's fast forward all the way to the late 1930s. Could and should the United States have been able to avoid World War II? My argument is still unambiguously the answer to that is yes. That in the main, and this is why you've got to read Adolf Hitler in the native, not only Mein Kampf, but the so-called Zweitsbuch, which was never published. Hitler actually wrote a second follow-on book in 1928, never published for various reasons, but that sort of outlined German foreign policy under a Nazi state. Hitler makes very plain in all these writings and in many of his speeches, he certainly didn't hide anything. He considered German destiny to lie in the East. He had no interest, frankly, for reasons of racial affinity, to fight a war with England. He considered the English to actually be a potentially good ally for Germany. He said, hey, with Germany as a great land power and British naval power, we can keep the peace in Europe. And we are part of the so-called Aryan race, according to Hitler. So I'm not going to defend any of his the undergirding of his thinking, but the fact is he had no interest in a war in the West. And of course, not least because he lived through the hell of it for 4 years in 1914 and 1918. So the point is that Britain trying to maintain its empire, and Churchill being very, very bellicose and wanting to impose British terms on European politics, was agitating all throughout the 1930s out of the government, was finally brought back into the government, he became the first Sea Lord, or I should say the head of the Admiralty at the onset of the war in 1939, but had been a backbencher all through the 1930s, but pounded away at how Britain needed to arm and get ready for war and needed to step in and fight if events warranted. And so in the end, what happened was, of course, Britain and France guaranteed Poland in March of 1939. Hitler up until the very end, and in the final week of August of 1939, again, there's so much history that typical analysts in the West and certainly American historians ignore, don't understand, don't know about. But it is a fact that the German government was trying to avoid a shooting war with the West. Now, it is true they were saying we want the so-called Polish corridor. Danzig is a German state, East Prussia, we want to be able to link up to that. So they did have territorial demands, but they were not looking for war with the West. But war was tripped into. There was the so-called phony war into the spring of 1940 when Hitler did decide to attack in the West and eliminate Britain and France from the battlefield. But the point is, again, this was all a European affair, and the United States need not have been involved and could have stood aside. Germany, by the way, all the way through until the actual events of December 1941, tried to avoid war with the United States. Hitler gave express orders to his naval forces: do not attack any American shipping. Consciously stay away from anything that's an American flag vessel, which is consistent with what they did in World War I, by the way. But again, thinking it through, had the United States maintained a neutrality, and again, this is pure conjecture. This is the problem with counterfactual analysis is you can't prove it, but nonetheless, the likely outcome is Germany was a stronger power than Russia, which was only propped up because of massive American and British aid. Had the Americans stayed out of that, likely the British would have settled with Germany, cut a peace, not to their satisfaction, but Hitler, as late as the summer of 1940, said, you can keep your empire, let's just end the war. And Churchill said no. And that's lauded today as this great and brilliant thing, but it just led to the continued slaughter. What happened was that, or what would have happened had the United States not propped up the Soviet Union, it is more than likely, in my view, and again, it's debatable, but there's sound reasons for thinking Germany would have been victorious all the way to the Urals. Germany had no interest in occupying all of the former Soviet Union. They were going to run that basically as vassal states, repopulate some of the areas out to as far as the Volga River that actually Germans had been flowing into since the early 1700s, Peter the Great and so forth. There were these so-called German Volga Germans. There were a few million German ethnics in Russia at the start of World War II that Stalin quickly moved all the way out to the Far East. But the net of it is Germany would have dominated Eastern Europe. Hungary and Romania would have certainly remained free. Italy would have remained on its own. And in turn, the war in Asia would have been a Chinese and Japanese conflict. The quote-unquote good news about that is there would have been no Mao Zedong. Maoism, the Chinese Communist Party that was already extant after 1934 and was in a civil war with Chiang Kai-shek. And then, of course, the Japanese invaded in the 1930s, fought a long, slow war, was actually not doing very well in that war, by the way. Would have ended in somewhat of a stalemate. Japan would have occupied Manchuria, gone no further. Would have certainly implied a China left to Chiang Kai-shek in the rest of China, or would have broken up into probably several states. But here's the key thing about Japan is the Emperor Hirohito and the Prime Minister, Prince Konoe, through the fall of 1941, before Tojo became the Prime Minister, was the quintessential warmonger in the Japanese government, wanted peace with the Americans. The key naval figure in Japan, Admiral Yamamoto, absolutely did not want war with the United States, had lived in the United States, had friends in America, admired America. Japan had, even as it became more militaristic in the 30s, still had strong Western leanings. They were trying to develop what they called a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That's the fancy name for their little empire. They resented the fact that the white man of Europe and the Americas considered them to be inferior Asians, so there was a little racial tensions there. But they never, the vast majority of people in the Japanese ruling classes had no interest in war with the United States. As late as September 1941, Emperor Hirohito told Prince Konwoi, settle matters with the Americans. I want peace with the United States. This was after the asset freeze in July of 1941. And a quick side note on that, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, again, one of the little things that aren't known, Roosevelt actually pushed for war with the Japanese, whom he didn't like very much. In 1939, 2.5 years before the start of hostilities, the United States unilaterally abrogated the 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. And in a series of economic embargo moves across 1940 and 41, began to strangle the Japanese economy. And as I'm sure most of you know, economic sanctions and embargoes are, in the circles of international diplomacy, considered to be acts of war. So in other words, the United States basically made war inevitable. And I'm not saying that Pearl Harbor, as it played out, was justified and so on, but it became inevitable based on what the Americans were doing to the Japanese well in advance of the war itself. Had we maintained neutrality, and again, going back to our founding fathers, I should have mentioned George Mason, and this as well, I had some writings on this, by maintaining this strict neutrality, this friend of liberty everywhere, guarantor only of our own, we maintain this moral high ground. America would everywhere be seen as this shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan used to say, and would have had a moral authority to prod and push both the Japanese and the Germans toward more liberal policies. And so the net of it is, pure conjecture on my part, Hitler had 40 plus attempts on his life. The most famous one is July 20, 1944, but there were several others going back to 1938. There were several times he came within a hair's breadth of being killed. At some point, Hitler would have likely either been removed from power or liquidated, because there were active resistance groups inside Germany throughout his reign, and certainly well into the war. But the American policy of prodded by Churchill, no surrender other than unconditional, sort of boxed the Germans in the corner. No pre-discussions of any negotiated peace and so forth. Had that war ended as it ended. And I also have to add that everybody asks, it has become very, very popular as a topic. What about the Europeans of Jewish extract? The Jews, of course, suffered horrifically under Hitler after the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. Several million were killed. We today, of course, call this the Holocaust. And the question is, would that have happened if America had remained neutral? Certainly, there's no doubt a lot of them would have been. But I still argue that the real impetus to the Holocaust was total war. Once the Americans were in and Germany was sort of against the world, it was this famous meeting of January 20, 1942, some 6.5 weeks after the American entry into the war, the so famous Wannsee Conference, where the so-called final solution was decided upon. As long as the United States remained neutral, could have even had commercial relations and had diplomatic relations and had people coming in and out of Germany at war, it would have been very hard to set up that system. And in fact, talks before the war about a homeland for the Jews, either in Palestine or elsewhere, might have borne fruit. So that's a whole other discussion, but I don't see how it could have been any worse. I certainly think there would have been ways to save lives had the United States been out. And so the net of it is, who won World War II? That's sort of the big question at the end of the day. And the answer is, I think, without a doubt, Joseph Stalin won World War II, and that United States entry into the war guaranteed, or as I like to say, made Europe safe for Stalinism, all the way to the so-called Iron Curtain, from Stettin in the Baltic down to Trieste. 200 million souls lost to communism for another 45 years. These ancient states, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, on and on and on, fell under Soviet domination. And I think there would have been a far better outcome had Germany taken the USSR to the mat, destroyed Stalinism, set up de facto vassal states in an empire in the East, and then in time, Germany would have liberalized, and of course, I think the same would have happened in Japan.
John?
Yes.
I'm interrupting here because we're reaching the end of our time window here. So we need to first ask, so what do we need to do today? Because, the case is made for sure, and then we'll try to grab a couple quickie questions. But what's kind of the conclusion in your mind? What do we need to do? Us that are listening and whoever else can hear this,
right?
What can we personally do?
Well, I would say study the real history, and I always like to offer some learning vehicles. So here are some fantastic books that I would argue really lay out the case for why an American foreign policy based on the taproots of our regime, which is that of a free republic, would have worked better. So really learn the history. And then the clear implications are it's never too late to do the right thing. So I've offered, what I think ought to be the moves the U.S. Foreign policy establishment ought to make going forward, which is make peace treaties with the people that we're currently either at war with formally or informally, end the empire. We've got some 1,000 military and naval bases around the world. We can get rid of most of those, get U.S. troops out of the Middle East, out of all the war zones, stop the guarantee of fighting other people's wars for them. And then I think peace is possible. I think accommodation, even in this age of the so-called virus that Trump loves to blame on China, when in fact the U.S. knew about it last fall. I think there are avenues to peace and friendship with both China and Russia. As I like to tell people, 98% of the Chinese and the Russians are good people, just like us. They want peace and commerce with us too. So yes, we have to worry about the revanchists in those regimes. I'm not saying we can be naive. I'm not saying we can sink our navy, but we should press for a here I'll use the word liberal, but in the 19th century sense, a truly liberal foreign policy.
All right, let's grab some questions here real quick.
Yep.
And see what we've got going on here. If anybody will do some hand raising. I see, Charles, you got your hand up.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff and John. Fantastic presentation. Not only do we have Stalin and his terror and communism throughout much of Asia because of World War II, but domestically we have a Leviathan state, a welfare warfare state that we might not have had absent what Churchill called the unnecessary war, not Tom Brokaw's Good War. How much less of a surveillance state do you think we would have absent World War II?
Boy, Charles, that's a great question. That's one of the punchline sort of lessons. If you go back and add up U.S. military and defense spending since the war to run what I call a de facto quasi-empire, it is, of course, in the dozens of trillions of dollars. And so how much wealthier would we be today? And forget prior to 1990 and forget everywhere else around the world. Just take the Middle East as a concrete example. Thanks to the great work of the Watson Institute at Brown University, I encourage everybody to go to their website and read their publications. And there's a secondary effort, by the way, at the Kennedy School at Harvard University, does the same kind of analysis. The numbers are very close, by the way, from a different set of researchers. Take the $7 trillion that we've spent on these wars in the Middle East that have led to some 7,000 or 8,000 American war dead, 60,000 maimed and wounded Americans that are walking around without arms and legs, that were, of course, the taxpayer is going to spend to support the rest of their lives, rightly so, but nonetheless, it's a fiscal burden. how much better would we be if we had those $7 trillion in the bank, so to speak, invested in the American economy and available for use in things such as a pandemic that we have today? So yeah, the answer, but that's a 5-hour discussion, Charles. But without a doubt, we'd be a much wealthier nation. Here's a punchline on that. I never fail to say it this way. I say the Bill Cristols, and I love to pick on. I had the good fortune to meet him and his father Irving, by the way. It was an old guy at the American Enterprise Institute. John Bolton was there. I used to have lunch with Bolton. And some of these guys, they will give you a long list of reasons why the U.S. activism, the so-called welfare warfare state, they don't like using that term, but that's what it is. They'll say, hey, here's why that's been a good thing, that it's kept the peace. And of course, they conjure up all these potential wars that would have been fought and everything else. But I always say to these people, I say, well, you say that, and we've spent all these trillions of dollars and fought all these wars, and the goal was to make us freer, safer, and wealthier. And I would argue that today we are less free, we're less safe and secure, and we're actually a lot poorer because of all of this nonsense. So, yeah, that's, you asked the great question, and there are some detailed studies of it at places like the Watson Institute that get into the trillions of dollars in terms of what we've lost.
What a great discussion that's been. Unfortunately, we've reached the conclusion of our time window, but you definitely put it exactly where we needed to end it on that closing refrain you just made.